So in this session now, what we're going to do is bring together a panel of senior technologists and innovators to discuss what business challenges they're facing, how to capture value from the collision of big and social data, and provide insight also on how to evolve your teams to meet this phenomenal challenge. But before we introduce the panel themselves, reach for your mobile devices, because I'm going to ask you a question. We're looking for your input here. Open up your texting app, and here is the question we're putting to you right now. And it's more of a statement than a question. We're using social as part of a big data project today. There's the statement. Now, you tell us how close you are. If you're thinking about it, text us with SDTH. If there's no social at all right now, SDNS. One or more projects, you have to text SDMOR. And finally, just the simple one, yes. That is SD, yes. That's really very nice and easy. Let's give that a few seconds to breathe, because this thing just continues to be live. The more text that comes in, the more we see a result. So far, I'm seeing half of the text coming in saying, yes, social is part of a big data project today, which means that half of you simply aren't there yet. Let's get some answers to this very difficult challenge. And welcome to the stage, Product Manager from Google BigQuery, Ju-Kei Kwek, CTO of Get Satisfaction, Dave Rowley, and the CTO of Marketwired, Stu Ogawa. Your panel. Stu, welcome. Good to see you. Dave. Have a seat. You saw the results of the study. Half of this audience are using social as part of big data. But before we get into that, what I'd love to do is just introduce yourselves to this audience. You each have a story, 30 seconds maximum on yourself and your organization. Stu, I'll start with you.
Hi, I'm Stuart Ogawa. I go by Stu. Work for a company called Marketwired. We provide technologies and media support to create, transmit, and listen to social conversations. We have about 15,000 customers global.
Thank you very much. Dave.
I'm Dave Rowley. I'm CTO at Get Satisfaction. Get Satisfaction is in the business of building community platforms for use by all kinds of brands. We've been doing it for about 6 years, so we know quite a bit about not only how communities are used, how people behave on them, and how businesses are taking advantage of those rich conversations.
Now, most of us, of course, have heard of Get Satisfaction and Marketwired, but Google, I'm sorry.
Company.
Yeah. Tell us a bit more.
Small company in Mountain View. Hi, everybody. My name is Ju-Kei Kwek. I run product strategy for Google's big data platform. We have a product called BigQuery. What we do is we work with companies to externalize Google's data processing capabilities, enable regular businesses to solve some of these emerging big data projects. One of my passions is working closely with customers on some of these early case studies, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of those today.
And that's exactly it. I want to hear, what are those successful customers doing right now with this challenge? But before we go into it, big data, this is the phrase, we're all just bandying it about. How do you define big data within your organizations? Dave?
So, I tend to use the classical definition. It's sort of a data set that is so massive that traditional means are not sufficient to deal with it. So, Robert Scoble was discussing and describing the plethora of sensors that are existing in the world today. And so they just generate all these data points. And, being able to sort of, throw that in a relational database and running a query, sequential queries against that just doesn't work. Also, the half-life of the utility of the data tends to be relatively short, so you have to take action on it quickly. So That's another problem that's not solved with traditional means.
So you see it like people see Twitter as a waterfall. It's there for a moment, it has value for a moment, and to an extent it then washes away.
Well, that's certainly true with a lot of data that fills these sort of big data repositories and weather data, traffic data, that sort of thing, right? It tends to be somewhat ephemeral, and so it necessitates a very quick, near real-time, visualization of it so that you can take action while it's relevant.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you because I want to know how social fits in, but still on the definition of big data, Stu.
I think not too far off. I mean, there's really two parts. One is you have the traditional machine-based, which are emitters or transmitters, that Robert talked about earlier, and then you have the new second generation of social where, you can't not think about the number of people in the world that have smart connected devices that are creating their own data that is not necessarily machine-based, but when you combine the two of those, the aggregate of that becomes a very, very large data set to ingest, process, and compute and store, which, again, back to you can't store and process that amount of data with the traditional means.
Clearly, we have to be picky, but I still want one more definition. Google, you've lived in the world of big data. Juke, how do you view it? How is it viewed internally?
Well, a couple of numbers just to put it into context. I mean, about 3 years ago, our search index was about 100 million gigabytes in size. And, the number of Gmail users is well over 500 million. So we deal with questions like, where are users having issues? Where are opportunities to serve our customers better? But I put those numbers out immediately just to put those away. Because really, it's really about the data that your organization is dealing with, right? And that can be anything from a couple hundred gigabytes, to small numbers of terabytes. Really, I think your definition was appropriate. It's what your current organization, tools, and processes might not be capable of processing. That's big data.
Right, got it. Okay, so now we're here to talk social. How do we divide it up? How do we split off social? How do we take advantage of that element? Where do the two collide? It's an open question. Who would like to start?
Well, I don't know that it's appropriate to sort of split it off, right? So it's relevant in context. And social has just created a new vector for this type of data that's difficult to manage in its sheer volume. It's difficult to manage in that, the tweets do have sort of a short half-life. And if Southwest Airlines wasn't able to sort of recognize and respond to that person's tweet, they wouldn't been the subject of a great story, right? So I think that social is just sort of a natural, if relatively new, input into a big data stream or a stream of data that's managed using big data techniques.
So, Stu, going back to your point as well, referencing back to what Scoble was talking about, really the Internet of Things, all these devices creating context, the social waterfall being the real content. Is that where you see the combination?
Yeah, I think it's with the social element, whether it's actually physically manifested by the person interacting with it, or it just happens naturally, which is, again, one of the technology features you're seeing. I think it's just a beautifully delicious way of consuming data when you have it both being intentionally as well as unintentionally, and you're being able to communicate that out. And the result of that is very, very large data sets.
And Juke, we're hearing some great ideas here already on how we should view this wave of data, but there are misconceptions out there. Some people, some organizations may be just not getting it right. What have you seen out there on the downside?
Well, I think one of the areas where I've seen organizations encountering roadblocks is just going out there and acquiring a bunch of infrastructure and data without really sort of asking themselves the questions. First, what are we trying to answer, right? And I see, unfortunately, a lot of these where they do the big spend, they get all this capital expenditure approved, set up a big project, and then sort of sit around scratching their heads going, now what?
What do we do? Is that the question you see from your customers, your clients, and their clients?
Yeah, a lot of times our global customers, they don't know what success looks like. Even if you had all this, can you say at the end of the day, we know what success looked like? Was this metric or this metric? But we gathered it all, and they say, so what?
Right.
We don't know what success looked like. So having that thought worked with Juke had mentioned is really important. Otherwise, you can spend a lot of money really fast and not know what success looks like.
And it's funny because, I've had many conversations along these lines. It is like we're all kids in a candy store. We know that it's all out there for us, but what do you take? So what does success look like, Dave?
Well, first, I wanted to comment on sort of the definition and the issues that people have with respect to social and big data. And I think that they use too narrow a definition, right? So social doesn't define big data, and big data doesn't define social. And there's a lot of very rich data, and sort of coming from my world, that's where we spend a lot of time. Very rich data that's perhaps not massive in quantity, but it's very deep, right? And the issue is, how are you going to use it, and how are you going to take action? There's that great story about the Moto X, the product manager, right, who asked for feedback, right? So you could ask for feedback. You could have posted that on Facebook or something like that and gotten, hundreds and hundreds or thousands of responses. But what are you going to do with it, right? He's asking for interaction and engagement, and you have to be prepared to actually, man up or woman up and
Right.
take advantage of that.
So, okay, let me drill down. What is the answer to what are we going to do about it? We get all this rich data,
Right.
because maybe we asked the right question, we have the relevant answer. What do we do with it?
Well, first off, your entire company has to be plugged into that, right? So it's not sufficient to just sort of have a silo of the folks who listen to what's going on and produce great visualizations or reports about what people are saying. Everybody who has some responsibility with the customer or with prospects needs to have access to and needs to be prepared to take action on that. And I think that's a transformation that we're starting to see in businesses and in sort of customer-centric and businesses who care about customer experience. And it changes really the shape of the organization and the responsibility of various folks and what they do and what kind of exposure they have to what people are saying.
All right.
I would chime in.
Yes,
I think,
do.
Action looks like, John, who just previously spoke, had some great examples of what action looks like. We see in their study, specifically product features, we see with our customers, our global customers, they're taking this information and they're actually building backlogs of features, what should be in their product before it even launches, or what's V1, 2, 3 look like. I think that happens in not just products, but also the services side. Whether the features do we emphasize or de-emphasize? So you see that more real-time nature in that side. I think by contrast, and to a little bit more real time, you're actually seeing some companies in the Valley that are taking this information and then real time feeding it back into their video streams or their digital media, and almost with a certain shortened latency cycle, being able to real time update what they want to show and present based on sentiment.
Right.
In context.
It's almost an unofficial focus group. UK, I want your view on this, but just take a pause for a moment. If you guys have questions for this panel, there is a way to submit those questions. We're going to bring it up on the big screen. You have to go to your text app, and you're going to text your question to 22333, but just précis your question with these letters, SDARC. That means they'll come to the right point. I'll be able to view them on my iPad. So type SDARC, then your question, and hopefully we'll get to as many as we have time for. Juke, I want to take us back to the rich data piece. Is it possible just to go, okay, let's mine for some rich data, let's find it, and let's do something with it?
Yeah, I think that's where we'd all like to get to, right? I think that there's you spoke very eloquently about, your example at the very beginning about being super reactive to customers, and I think we have a lot of these where we have engagement and customer communities. But I think it really begs the question in many businesses, how do I actually get started with this, right? I guess we did a little poll, and roughly 50% had not gotten started, right? And so it's really about, yes, we'd like for our organizations to become socially enabled, big data analytics enabled, but how do we get started? What I've seen in terms of successful on-ramping is starting small, asking specific questions. And just one quick example.
Yes, please.
In retail, what many retailers are asking, and they're very clear about these questions, is who are my best customers? Where are my best customers, right? What are the margins on those customers? How does that relate to things like the different locations that I have geographically? And what kind of market baskets are they purchasing? And it's understanding the interleaving of all these things, but it starts with just basically, asking those very simple questions first. And what we find, this is a practice we do at Google, is we actually don't try to know all of the questions up at once, because you can't.
Right.
Right? So we start by asking actually very naive questions of the data, and then the more questions we ask, the more intelligent those questions start to become. But it does rely on having the infrastructure in place to do that.
I want to hear stories. I want to hear some insight from your customers, your global customers that maybe are taking that Juke approach, starting small, asking the right questions, then drilling further in to get the true value. Dave, Stu, what have you seen?
Well, sort of an interesting trend that we've seen around online communities is oftentimes the driver for a company to use an online community is around customer support and customer care, because it's a very natural way to reduce your support costs, right? You're building a knowledge base, basically, of user-generated content that will oftentimes answer questions that people have about your product or how to use it or a problem that they're having. And there are a lot of things that you have to do to make that successful, and it's really around making sure that that content is discoverable, highly discoverable, because people tend to search before they ask, right? So you want to try to increase the likelihood that they'll find something close to what they're looking for. Well, guess what? these exact mechanisms and this exact pattern of behavior also applies to content marketing. So we can see that a lot of the questions that people are asking, even though they might result in getting exposed to a discussion about why a product doesn't work for them, are the kinds of things that are driving acquisition. They're sort of pre-sales conversations. And so applying everything that we learned about how to build a platform that solves a customer support problem actually can be applied to how do you solve a content marketing and an inbound marketing problem.
Got it, right. So you're going to know what your problem is before you even start. Stu?
One of our customers is Adidas, and it was interesting to see Adidas mentioned up here.
So what was the name of the
Adidas.
Adidas, yeah.
And so Adidas would actually be listening culturally into the different countries. What's the language? What's the type of slang? The localization cues that they want to hear about so they know how to send their messages correctly in the right tone and messaging so that it effectively hits the right influencer or people who have great influence in messaging to others who are going to retweet. So we see a lot of that type of analysis being done as well.
And it's funny. I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I see this constant manipulation of language. There was a story of some sentiment analysis being done on American Idol, and the system was misinterpreting the word sick as being negative, like this person's sick, very unwell. But of course, sick no longer means that. It means incredibly cool. And we've got to be on top of that all the time. Your questions are literally flooding in. It's the waterfall again. Let's see which ones we can hit nice and fast. Juke, for you, what are your thoughts on YouTube social data? Is more going to be done to enable better APIs? You may not be able to answer that, but your view on YouTube. Of course.
Yeah, no, I can't really comment on the plans that we have, but to the extent that I'll speak about this generally, I think YouTube is one of a number of sources that we can use to extract customer activity. And I think it becomes very valuable when we're able to layer that on with the other business data that we have. So, for example, I'll stick with retail because this is, just to continue this example. But phase 2 of this particular retail project was actually starting to layer in social data. So things like, customer activity on blogs, Twitter, and so forth, right? And what this customer was looking for was actually to go beyond the traditional segments of customers that they were getting from some of the conventional consumer companies. They did this study called microsegmentation, where by looking at their customer loyalty data and then matching it with some of these data from these social sources, they were able to come up with their own new segments of loyalists, married couples, no children, so forth, and in very fine grain in different locations, and then start to use that to do micro-marketing targeting, which they realized was much more effective at doing things like promotions to help with understock and overstock scenarios.
All right, thank you for the words of wisdom. Next question. I'm going to rush through as many as I can. I like the way this one's been written. An infinite amount of, in parenthesis, WO, man hours, so woman and man hours, can be poured into social. What are the useful messaging constraints to limit hours and to maximize impact? Where do we draw the line? Dave.
Well, so you're right. It does sort of suggest that you could spend an infinite amount of time on this data. And so the notion of curation and sort of involving the crowd, people beyond your walls to help make sense of and respond to this, I think that's the emphasis of advocacy and building brand advocates who are going to speak on your behalf. So you have to have some leverage. You have to take advantage of the network effect, basically, of the people who are participating in these conversations.
I think there's a so what factor. So you get all this data, you spent all the time and money, to your point, and it goes back to what did you really want to do with this data? What was success looking like that? So, for example, we had one very large company that we're dealing with that researched over almost 100 billion tweets over the past couple of years to find out, we want to find the nicest person in the social world. And they were able to narrow it down to a specific person in Wisconsin. And based on certain criteria the company was looking for, they found this person.
What did they do to them?
They gave them a welcome parting gift.
Right, I bet they did. So at least they had an objective. Because I think that's one of the questions that's coming out here is, where do you start? Do you start with an objective? If I want to sell more widgets in California to people of a certain demographic group, is that my starting point?
I think you can start there, or understanding how to close the loop. I think that's been mentioned both by Guy and John several times. With a lot of the social data, if you don't know how to close the loop and you don't know what success looks like in closing that loop, you will just, again, you will be spinning your wheels for a long period of time. So in this particular case, they found that person.
Yeah.
I think in the case of a lot of segmentation, where in context you're able to find out which of these micro campaigns, as Juke mentioned, I know if I identify these types of folks in this kind of context, we'll have a much higher closing rate. And so those type of metrics for success really prove out if you are very diligent and have that level of discipline.
But then go and close the deal. All right, next question.
Right.
What are the biggest technical missteps that you see organizations making when creating big data architecture? Tactical or strategic or something else? Juke, do you want to start us off?
Sure.
Where are the mistakes?
Well, I think a very common one and very well-intentioned one is to start looking at the technology first, right? And think, see some nodding heads there, yeah. So, nothing against Hadoop, but, I use that term as just a sort of a catch-all to illustrate that we can be very easily, seduced into thinking that, if only we have, this particular technology or this particular skill set, then all our problems are going to be solved. Actually, what can often happen is, these technologies cause additional problems, right? Because once you bring in a sophisticated new technology, that's only just the start. There's a lot of care and feeding. There's helping the organization to figure out how that technology fits in. So one of the things that we advise to our customers is actually, let's think about technology second, but really try and answer your business questions and start with those up front. And when it comes to social data, many of those organizations, the thing that I see is a good structure actually starts with an analytics team. Right? And I'm not talking about, sort of data scientists, right? I'm talking about business analysts who sort of adopt this iterative style of hypothesis, experiment, measure, feed it back in, what Stu described as closing the loop. That's one path to success that I've seen.
All right. Any other errors, technical or strategic, that you guys have seen?
I agree 100% with what you're saying. Any sort of analytics initiative has to start with the questions that you want to answer. Some of the missteps that we see is a great deal of emphasis being put on, gathering as many, Facebook followers, as many, Twitter followers, just to try to build this. And then it's like, now what are we going to do? Even if you've constructed a technology base that allows you to sort of manage this and pick apart and slice and dice this data, if you haven't answered, asked the questions that you're, trying to answer from a business perspective, it's just an interesting computer science experiment. And that's, between 2010 and 2012, this period that we sometimes call the social haze, that was all the emphasis. And then now it's like, so what's the ROI? Or, how are you actually making money from this? How is this contributing to an enhanced customer experience? You have to really start with those questions, and then sort of figure out what's the appropriate technology. And there's just a growing number of choices that you have because this industry has arisen out of the big data problem.
Got it.
Yeah, I would concur. I mean, I think two things. One is big data does not equal analytics. You could do great analytics and get great results from very small data sets. So you don't have to be able to compute, store, ingest terabytes of data to get great results. And so knowing what the success look like could be, in fact, a much smaller data set, which may not necessarily be big data. It could be applying just good analytics, to Juke's point, and then, hey, I got the results that I was looking for. Wonderful, without spending the billions of dollars.
Yeah. But then it once again begs the question, who would that suit? Who's right for that type of micro research? This question came in twice. What industries benefit most from social data? Are there any certain industries that benefit more than others?
It's interesting. We look at sort of the types of our customers who tend to get the most value from their customer communities. And it's all across the board, industry-wise, and even size of company. And a lot of the companies that you wouldn't think are particularly social brands tend to be sort of poster children for the successful use of social data in customer communities. They do tend to have a few things in common. One is that there's some commonality to either the product or the way the product is used. so that there's relevance. You can sort of get this effect of people having the same kind of questions, the same things to talk about. And then the other attribute is that there's some complexity to the subject matter. And so sometimes that it's, the product is complex. It's networking equipment. It's something like that. There's a lot of things to talk about and to figure out. But, Pampers is a successful community, a very successful community of ours. A diaper is a pretty, simplistic device. But infants aren't. And so infants tend to be about the same across, the world population. So there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of complexity there, and there's a lot of value then from a platform that sort of supports those kinds of conversations.
Data from diapers. I like it. It just sounds like a book.
Yeah, big data, big diapers. I don't know.
Nice. Let's correct that. Big data, full diapers. How's that? Juke, talk to me about teams. How should we, as organizations in this room, structure the team that goes forward to make the most of the social data challenge?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I mean, just going back to what I was talking about before, I think that it helps a lot to start with the analytics first. That isn't always the most obvious thing, especially when we have very legitimate concerns. If you think about most organizations today that set up as traditional BI, serving a small analytics team that serves the line of business, and it's usually the CIO or the director of BI that gets tasked with the problem first, and then many of the analysts are downstream. In terms of teams and organizations, some of the things that I've seen in terms of successful interactions of these teams involves the analytics team actually being front and center, and not so much a downstream consumer of the technology when it's all said and done, but really involved in defining the success criteria and those project requirements up front as a partner to the technology teams.
All right, great. Any final views on the team? Because then I want to move forward to our last question, which is where does it go from here? So final comments on teams.
Yeah, I think the feature teams, I've seen very successfully having, to Juke's point, but these feature teams have both the business stakeholders as well as the technology stakeholders. They're mutually aligned as to what success looks like. And start small and iterate and grow and refine.
Right.
And you see that success, that criteria over and over and over at various companies. You see that happening for the successful companies.
Well, indeed. And every time you start small and you meet with a little success, everybody else wants a part of
right.
it.
I mean, you have to break down the silos, and sometimes those walls are very rigid. And so the value that you can get is limited by how widespread within the organization it's both visible and actionable. So organizational trends that we see where the voice of the customer, through whatever means is being used, as sort of moves towards the center of the organization, those tend to be the ones that are successful.
All right, wonderful. Last question then, in the 2 minutes and 19 seconds we have left, is where from here? If we're all sitting here in, say, 2 years' time, what will we be discussing? I'm going to start with you, Stu.
I think a lot of what we're at an nascent stage, so a lot of what we're collecting right now, social data / big data, when you combine those two, a lot of it looks to me more reporting. It's here's what we have, let's look backwards and have a metric towards that, as opposed to, I think, 3 to 5 years out, where you're going to be looking at much more, what will they be saying?
Right.
What should they be doing? Mm-hmm. Let's have a much more predictive, forward-thinking conversation as opposed to just taking data and saying that's analytics and looking backwards and pretending that that's a forward conversation. That's not a forward-thinking conversation at all. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to be having the latter kind of conversation several years as opposed to the prior.
That is fascinating, because the moment the data is created, it's already in the past. Dave.
Done.
So customer experience management has actually been around for about 10 years, right? But we're seeing sort of a trend towards, this becoming more mainstream. So you start to see, Fortune 100 companies who have, customer care officers or customer experience officers. So I would expect that trend to continue, and I would expect a focus around customer experience to be much more widely adopted and much more mainstream. This has great implications about the tools, the techniques, the data, and the sort of the organizational structure around this. You can't hide bad customer experience any longer, right? Ask British Airways. And you can't impose customer experience. Customer experience isn't something you buy, right? It's the experience of the customers with your company. So it's really thinking about all the ways that your customers interact with you and making sure that those things are tied together and have sort of a central view of what that customer is about.
All right. It's the best safety net yet. Juke, final thoughts?
My crystal ball is usually pretty foggy, but based on what we've seen and what we've learned working with customers so far, I think we're going to see two trends. One is a number of these early projects are going to start to get operationalized, and Google has already started to publish case studies on some of these early successes. I think what we'll see is a much more mainstreaming of data-based decision-making throughout the organization and a devolution of decisions throughout as more line managers and individual employees get empowered by this data through these solutions. The flip side of that, I think, is going to be we're going to see a lot more controversy in terms of privacy and security, right? There's no need to be a genius to think about that, but I think it is going to be an important part of the dialogue, and so it's something for all of us to be conscious of moving forward.
That's very interesting. Great words of wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel, Juke Kwek, Dave Rowley, and Stu Ogawa. Thank you very much indeed. And